For 3,000 years, Earth had known nothing but peace. The world had changed greatly since the time of wars, fighting, and destruction. Gone were the days of bloodshed and suffering. Humans had learned from their past mistakes and built a better world. In the cities, people lived peacefully, with no fear of war. Governments had found ways to work together, creating a world where resources were shared and conflicts were settled through talks, not battles. It was a time of great harmony. The leaders of the world gathered often to discuss their peaceful ways. They spoke of how far humanity had come, from the old days of destruction to this bright new age. Technology had advanced, and people lived longer, healthier lives. Diseases that once killed millions were now gone. No one could remember the last time a war had broken out. It seemed as though peace would last forever. But even in this time of calm, there were whispers of something more. Deep within the hearts of some, a quiet fear grew. They knew that peace was fragile, that it could be broken in an instant. It was a truth they did not want to face, but it lingered in their minds. Many chose to ignore it, telling themselves that nothing could disrupt the life they had worked so hard to build. One day, as the sun rose over the peaceful cities of Earth, a strange event occurred. It was not something that could be seen, but something that could be felt. The air seemed to change, heavy with an unknown tension. People went about their daily lives, unaware of the storm that was beginning to form in the distance. At the Global Council meeting, the leaders discussed the usual matters: trade, technology, the environment, and peace, the usual topics that had been on their minds for centuries. But this time, something was different. A message appeared on every screen in the meeting room, interrupting their discussions. It was a simple, strange message coming from an unknown source. Prepare, the time has come. The message was short, but it carried a weight that none of the leaders could ignore. It sent a chill through the room. They looked at each other, unsure of what to make of it. Who sent this message? What did it mean? There was no answer. The message disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. For a moment, the room was silent. The leaders exchanged uneasy glances. Was this some kind of joke? But there was no laughter. No one dared to speak. Finally, the chairperson spoke, his voice shaky. This could be a prank. Perhaps someone is trying to cause panic. But we cannot ignore it. We must investigate. The room agreed, but the feeling of unease stayed with them. They knew that the message was not to be taken lightly. After all, the world had known peace for so long. The idea of danger seemed distant, almost impossible. Yet, something inside each of them whispered that this could be the beginning of the end. Elsewhere in the world, people went about their lives without knowing what was happening at the Global Council. They had no idea of the strange message or the sense of unease that had started to spread among the leaders. But the world was not as peaceful as it seemed. In small villages and quiet towns, there were those who had always felt that something was wrong. These were people who lived on the edges of society, often ignored by the world's leaders. They had always felt that peace was an illusion, something that could not last forever. They had seen the signs that others missed: the small changes in the world, the strange weather patterns, the odd noises at night. They spoke among themselves, warning each other that something was coming, something that would change everything. In the dark corners of the world, far from the bright lights of the cities, ancient groups still held on to old knowledge. They had studied the stars, the planets, and the patterns of nature for centuries. They knew that the peace humanity had enjoyed could not last. It was only a matter of time before the storm came. As the days passed, the message was quickly forgotten by most. The people of Earth continued with their peaceful lives, going to work, attending school, and enjoying their quiet existence. But beneath the surface, something was stirring, and the strange message would not be the only warning. One day, a group of scientists working in a remote lab detected something unusual. At first, they thought it was a mistake, something that could be explained away. But the data kept coming, and it was unlike anything they had ever seen. There was an unknown force in space, moving toward Earth. It was still far away, but it was coming closer every day. The scientists were puzzled. They could not explain it, but they knew one thing for certain. It was unlike anything they had encountered before. The news spread quickly among the scientific community, but most people dismissed it as a minor anomaly. The world had grown so comfortable in its peace that no one truly believed any real danger could threaten them. But as the days turned into weeks, the scientists' findings became impossible to ignore. The strange force in space was not natural. It was not a comet, not an asteroid. It was something much more mysterious, something that carried an ominous feeling. The peaceful world that humanity had built was about to face its greatest challenge. The calm before the storm was over, and the first signs of danger were beginning to show. But for now, the people of Earth continued to live in blissful ignorance, unaware of the storm that was fast approaching. They had no idea that their world, as they knew it, was about to change forever. The leaders of the world gathered once again to discuss the strange events that had been unfolding. The peace they had enjoyed for centuries had started to show cracks. It wasn't something people spoke about openly, but there was a growing sense of unease among the global community. The message had been received, and even though many had dismissed it as a hoax, others could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. There were whispers in every corner of the world. Something was coming, something they couldn't stop. In the Global Council's meeting room, the air was thick with tension. The usual calm demeanor of the leaders was replaced with a quiet, uneasy silence. Everyone waited for someone to speak, but no one seemed to have an answer. The idea that peace could be threatened was so foreign to them that it seemed impossible. Their world had changed so much that they couldn't even imagine what could disrupt it. "Are we really going to just ignore the message?" asked one of the council members, a woman known for her calm, logical thinking. She was the first to break the silence. It came from somewhere. "We can't pretend it's nothing." Her words caused a ripple of discomfort in the room. The chairperson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly troubled but reluctant to show it. "We don't even know what this message means. Who sent it? Why now?" he replied, his voice betraying a hint of doubt. The group fell silent again. The message, "Prepare, the time has come," had haunted them all. It wasn't the message itself that worried them. It was the feeling it gave. It was too precise, too urgent. And then there was the strange data that had been coming from space. Scientists had detected a powerful force moving toward Earth, but no one knew what it was. Could it be connected? Was this the beginning of something they weren't prepared for? Outside the meeting room, the world carried on. People were going about their usual routines, blissfully unaware of the danger that was slowly creeping closer. The news reports were filled with stories of scientific discoveries, breakthroughs in technology, and talks of global cooperation. There was nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. Life continued as it always had, peaceful and calm. But deep within the scientific community, the situation was becoming more urgent. Dr. Rachel Sanchez, an astrophysicist, had been tracking the mysterious force for weeks. She had tried to convince her colleagues that the situation needed immediate attention, but most of them were too wrapped up in their own work to take her seriously. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping through the cracks. It was late one night when Dr. Sanchez made a discovery. She had been working alone in the observatory, looking at the latest data. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she tried to make sense of the numbers in front of her. The force was still too far away to be seen clearly, but the patterns were unmistakable. There was something out there, something large, and it was heading straight for Earth. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as the realization hit her. This was not just a random event. It was purposeful. She quickly gathered her notes and rushed to the Global Council, hoping to convince them that the situation was far more serious than they thought. But when she arrived, she found the council meeting in chaos. The mood in the room had shifted. Leaders who had once been calm and composed were now anxious, speaking over one another. The message, the strange force, and the growing fear were all coming to a head. The chairperson stood at the front, trying to restore order, but it was clear that even he was struggling to keep control. Dr. Sanchez didn't wait to be called on. She pushed her way to the front, her voice shaking but determined. "You need to listen to me," she said. "The force in space is not just a passing anomaly. It's coming for us. And if we don't act now, we won't be ready when it arrives." The room fell silent. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The leaders stared at her, unsure of what to say. For the first time in centuries, the unthinkable had been placed before them, the possibility that the world's peace might not last forever. "How long do we have?" asked one of the council members, his voice low. Dr. Sanchez hesitated, looking down at her data. "Not much time. If we don't prepare, we could be caught off guard. And I don't think we want to take that risk." The chairperson stood and addressed the room, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. "We must take this seriously. If what Dr. Sanchez is saying is true, then our entire way of life is at risk. But we cannot panic. We need to gather all the information we can and make a plan." The leaders nodded, but the tension in the room was undeniable. For the first time in 3,000 years, the peace they had built seemed fragile. The world had grown complacent, certain that the future would be nothing like the past. But the warning was clear. Something was coming, and they had no idea what it was. As the meeting continued, Dr. Sanchez watched the leaders argue over what actions to take. Some wanted to start gathering resources, while others suggested strengthening global defense systems. But one thing was clear: no one had any answers. They had never faced a threat like this before. Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of the world, there were still those who had prepared for this moment. Ancient societies and secret groups who had long ago predicted that peace could not last forever. They had known that one day something would disrupt the calm. And now it seemed their time had come. The world, for all its peace, had forgotten the lessons of the past. They had forgotten that nothing in the universe is permanent, and as the days passed, the unknown force continued its slow journey toward Earth, a reminder that peace, no matter how long it lasts, can be shattered in an instant. The world had started to change in ways no one could explain. The signs were subtle at first, small things that could easily be dismissed. Strange weather patterns began to emerge in places where they had never been seen before. Unusual storms swept through quiet regions, leaving no real damage but stirring an uncomfortable feeling among the people. Then came the fires. It started in a small village, far from the bustling cities, where no one had ever suspected anything out of the ordinary. The fire began in the forests that surrounded the settlement, but it didn't spread in the way anyone would expect. It didn't follow the usual patterns of wildfires. It moved with a precision that was unlike anything natural. It wasn't just the fire that shocked the villagers. It was the way it seemed to appear out of nowhere and burn in places that should have been untouched. At first, people thought it was a freak occurrence. Forest fires were common, especially in the dry seasons. But as more fires started to appear in unexpected places, across fields, in the middle of cities, and even in the sky, panic began to spread. No one could understand how these fires were igniting, and more importantly, why they were so different from anything seen before. The fires grew, moving faster and with a strange, unexplainable force. They didn't seem to be fueled by anything. There were no dry conditions that could account for their rapid spread. And yet, they roared to life, consuming everything in their path. People began to fear that the fires weren't simply a result of nature. They felt as though something was controlling them. But who or what that could be remained a mystery. In the midst of the chaos, the Global Council scrambled to respond. No one knew what was causing the fires, and their ability to control the situation seemed to slip further away with each passing hour. As the flames spread, cities that had been symbols of humanity's progress now faced the reality of being engulfed by an uncontrollable force. People fled their homes, leaving behind their belongings, their memories, and their lives, as the fires seemed to chase them across the land. Amidst the growing panic, Dr. Rachel Sanchez and a group of scientists were working around the clock to understand the fires. She knew that they weren't just a coincidence. There was something behind them, something deliberate. But what and why now? She spent hours in the observatory, studying the strange data that had been collected. It was then that she discovered something even more unsettling. The fires seemed to be connected to the unknown force moving toward Earth. As the mysterious object in space continued its journey, the fires grew stronger. It was as if the two were linked, like the fires were a signal, a warning of something far worse to come. The realization hit Dr. Sanchez like a wave. The fires were not random. They were not just the result of an environmental disaster. They were being guided. But by whom? Or what? At the same time, the Global Council convened once more to address the crisis. The fires were no longer just an isolated event. They were now a global catastrophe. Leaders from all corners of the Earth were calling for action, but none of them had any clear solutions. The usual methods of disaster response were ineffective. There was no way to stop the fires, and they didn't even know how they had started in the first place. As the world scrambled to respond, people began to wonder if this was the beginning of the end. If this was only the first wave, what else was coming? The peaceful world that humanity had built over the centuries seemed to be unraveling before their very eyes. Some feared that the world as they knew it might never be the same again. Across the globe, small communities of people began to take matters into their own hands. In some places, people banded together to try to fight the fires, creating makeshift barriers to hold them back. But their efforts were futile. No matter what they did, the fires seemed to push forward, unstoppable. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. There was no way to control something that didn't behave like anything natural. The panic grew as cities that had once been bustling centers of life were now abandoned. The once thriving metropolises were now empty shells, their streets lined with the wreckage of homes and businesses. People had fled in a desperate attempt to escape the inferno that was creeping ever closer. It wasn't just the fires themselves that were terrifying. It was the fear of what they meant. There were rumors spreading that the fires were connected to the mysterious force in space. Some believed it was a harbinger of something far worse. As the flames grew, so did the fear. The people of Earth had known peace for so long, and now they were being faced with a challenge they couldn't understand. Dr. Sanchez continued to work with other scientists, trying to make sense of the connection between the fires and the force in space. The data was becoming more and more troubling. The force was growing stronger, and the fires were following its path. It was as if the world itself was being prepared for something terrible, something beyond human comprehension. And then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, a new threat appeared on the horizon. The skies, which had been clear for years, began to change. Strange, dark clouds formed in the atmosphere, swirling in patterns that no one could explain. It wasn't just the weather. It felt as if the very air itself was being twisted into something unnatural. The fires raged on, now feeding on the land with an intensity that seemed to match the ominous storm above. People watched in fear as the sky darkened, and the fires burned brighter, more intense than before. It was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a matter of understanding what was happening, and if there was any way to stop it before it consumed everything. With each passing hour, the world moved closer to the unknown, unsure of what was coming next. What had seemed like a peaceful world was now a land of uncertainty, and the people who had lived in comfort for so long found themselves faced with an enemy they couldn't even begin to understand. The fires were just the beginning, and no one knew how far this new threat would go. The fires had begun to take on a life of their own. No longer were they just something to fight. They were a force of nature that no one could control or predict. And as the smoke thickened and the heat became unbearable in many regions, the world started to feel the weight of a looming disaster that was slowly and steadily advancing. People had lost their homes, their way of life, and the once familiar comfort of peace. The ancient promise of stability that humanity had so proudly built over the years seemed to be crumbling, piece by piece. As the fires spread across continents, Dr. Rachel Sanchez's theory had started to gain more traction among the global scientific community. The connection between the fires and the strange anomaly in space had become undeniable. Her calculations showed that the phenomenon wasn't just a passing event. It was becoming more intense with every passing day. It was as if the Earth was being pushed toward a tipping point, a moment when everything they knew would change forever. The world's leaders were scrambling. They had been caught unprepared for the scale of the disaster, and the resources they had once considered plentiful now seemed to be in short supply. Governments around the globe were in crisis mode, making decisions that felt rushed and uncertain. Many were sending aid to the regions hardest hit by the fires, but no one seemed to have a clear plan on how to stop them. As each new fire started, it only served to remind everyone that their understanding of the world and their ability to control it was now in question. The Global Council convened again, but this time the atmosphere was different. The usual sense of order had been replaced with a quiet desperation. Leaders who had once been calm and composed were now grappling with their own fears. They had built a world on the idea of progress, of growth, and of peace, but the fires had shattered that illusion. If they couldn't even understand what was happening in their own atmosphere, how could they prepare for the unknown force in space? In the midst of all the uncertainty, a handful of global leaders began to seek a solution outside the conventional. There were whispers of using the world's collective knowledge and technology to try to reach the mysterious force in space. But how? No one had a plan. The technology didn't exist, and no one could say for sure whether it would work. Still, the idea of doing nothing was even worse than the thought of failure. Dr. Sanchez, having grown more desperate, started to push her colleagues for a more immediate response. She believed that understanding the force wasn't enough. Humanity had to act. Every piece of information she gathered, every pattern she studied, pointed to the fact that the threat from space wasn't just something that could be observed from afar. It was coming closer, and if they didn't act soon, it would be too late to stop it. But even as the world's brightest minds gathered in research labs and observatories to find a solution, the situation on Earth was growing worse. Entire forests were being reduced to ash in a matter of hours, and crops that had once been the lifeblood of nations now lay burnt and lifeless in the fields. Water sources that were once abundant had been contaminated by the fires, and the air was thick with smoke. People had begun to migrate in large groups, seeking refuge wherever they could find it, though there was no safe place left untouched by the creeping flames. Despite the bleakness of the situation, there were still glimmers of hope. The same communities that had once relied on the stability of peace and technology were now beginning to find new ways to survive. People started to rebuild in small pockets, creating makeshift villages where they could live off the land. Though their lives were marked by uncertainty, they held on to the hope that somehow, together, they could push through this crisis. In the largest cities, emergency measures were put into place to protect as many people as possible. Emergency shelters were set up, and humanitarian organizations from around the world rushed in to provide aid. It wasn't enough to halt the destruction, but it was a small step towards saving lives. The world had not faced a disaster of this magnitude in living memory, and it showed in the faces of those who had once been certain of their future. Now, they were uncertain, even afraid. The fires were only the beginning, and as the global community tried to come together to respond, a new discovery was made. The dark clouds that had been seen swirling in the sky weren't just part of a weather phenomenon. They were something more. Scientists observed the clouds shifting in patterns that didn't align with known atmospheric behaviors. They appeared to be reacting to the fires themselves, growing more intense in the areas where the flames were most active. Something was happening to the planet, something that no one could explain. In the quiet of her lab, Dr. Sanchez was piecing together a terrifying conclusion. The strange force in space wasn't just affecting the weather. It seemed to be altering the very fabric of Earth's atmosphere. And as she looked at the data, she came to a grim realization. The fires were part of a larger, more complex chain of events. The force in space wasn't just a passive entity. It was actively influencing the Earth in ways that had never been seen before. It was as if the planet itself was being reshaped, prepared for something the human race couldn't yet comprehend. As the days passed, the fires grew even stronger. Their intensity continued to spread, and the global community began to brace for whatever was coming next. People no longer focused solely on survival. They began to question the meaning of all that had come before them. Had they ignored the signs? Had they been too caught up in their own achievements to notice the subtle warnings that had been there all along? The idea of peace, once so certain, now felt like an illusion. The world had entered an era of uncertainty, where survival and hope hung in the balance. As they watched the dark clouds grow, the fires rage, and the mysterious force continue its approach, one question remained: would humanity find a way to stop it? Or was this just the beginning of something far beyond their control? As the days turned into weeks, the global crisis continued to unfold. The fires, which had started as isolated incidents, now seemed like an unstoppable force, consuming everything in their path. What once seemed like a natural disaster was now understood to be something far more complex and far more dangerous. People began to wonder, was this simply a coincidence, or was there something far larger at play? Dr. Rachel Sanchez had been working tirelessly to decipher the link between the fires and the growing phenomenon in space. With each passing day, her findings grew more unsettling. The fires weren't just spreading randomly. They were following a pattern that seemed to mirror the movement of the strange force from space. She had begun to suspect that the fires were only the beginning of a larger transformation, one that humanity wasn't prepared for. Her team worked around the clock, trying to understand the data that had been collected. But there was something troubling about the patterns. The force from space was becoming stronger, its presence more pronounced, and it seemed to be influencing everything it touched. The air, the weather, even the very soil of the Earth was being affected by this unseen power. Dr. Sanchez was beginning to suspect that the changes were not only coming from space, but from something deeper within the planet itself. As she studied the data further, she made a breakthrough that sent shockwaves through her team. The fires, she realized, were not a natural occurrence at all. They were being influenced by something much more profound, an energy field that was slowly, but surely, taking hold of the Earth. This energy, she theorized, was connected to the mysterious force in space, and it was gradually altering the very fabric of their world. The fires were merely a symptom of a much greater shift that was taking place. But what could this force be? And what did it want? Meanwhile, across the globe, people were beginning to realize that they were no longer living in the world they once knew. The once bustling cities now lay abandoned, their streets deserted. The fires had left nothing untouched, and the world had become a shadow of itself. But it wasn't just the physical destruction that weighed heavily on people's minds. It was the growing uncertainty about what would happen next. The idea that their planet was changing in ways that no one could fully comprehend was terrifying. In the midst of this chaos, a new form of communication had begun to spread. Whispers of something beyond the fires. Some spoke of strange lights in the sky, of unnatural shifts in the earth beneath their feet. Some even claimed that the very air felt different, as if it was alive, shifting with a mind of its own. These whispers grew louder with each passing day, as more and more people began to feel that the fires were only the first warning. There was something bigger on the horizon. While governments and scientists worked around the clock to figure out how to stop the fires, the people were left to wonder, was there any hope? Could the fires be contained, or was this just the beginning of something that couldn't be stopped? The world had once been a place of progress, of innovation, of peace, but now it seemed as though all of that had been stripped away, leaving only uncertainty and fear in its place. As the fires continued to rage, Dr. Sanchez and her team had begun to focus on one particular aspect of their research: the growing power of the energy field. It wasn't just affecting the Earth, It was also affecting the very technology that had been the backbone of human civilization. Communications were becoming more sporadic, and once reliable systems began to fail. The energy field seemed to be disrupting everything it touched, making it impossible to predict what would happen next. In the midst of this uncertainty, the world's leaders came together in a desperate attempt to find a solution. They had come to realize that they could no longer rely on their old methods of problem-solving. The traditional ways of responding to disasters, sending in emergency relief, coordinating resources, were no longer enough. The firestorms were no longer something that could be handled with basic tools and technology. They were dealing with something beyond their comprehension, and the entire world was at the mercy of this unknown force. The meeting between the world leaders was tense. No one had any answers, and no one knew how to stop the fires from spreading further. But as they discussed their options, a new idea began to take shape. They could try to reach out to the force in space. If it was connected to the changes they were seeing on Earth, perhaps they could make contact and ask it to stop. The idea seemed outlandish, even ridiculous, but with every passing day, it became more and more clear that nothing else was working. Dr. Sanchez's research had shown that the energy field was slowly moving toward Earth, and if the patterns held, the worst was yet to come. The firestorms were merely a precursor to something far larger, a transformation that would change the world and humanity forever. But was it a transformation that could be stopped? Or was the planet simply being prepared for something else, something beyond human understanding? As humanity watched the skies darken and the fires burn hotter, the world held its breath. There was no going back. The peaceful age of human civilization was slipping away, and no one knew what would take its place. People tried to hold on to hope, but the evidence suggested that hope was fading, replaced by the terrifying reality that something far bigger than anything they had ever imagined was coming. And then, just when it seemed as though all was lost, a strange message was intercepted. It wasn't a transmission from Earth. It wasn't even from a known source. It was a signal, an unexplainable communication that seemed to emanate from the very force that had been causing the chaos. The message was simple, yet profound, and it sent a wave of fear and curiosity through the scientific community. It was the first sign that the mysterious force in space was not just a natural occurrence, but something far more intelligent, far more purposeful. The message, though cryptic, seemed to be offering a choice. The world had a decision to make. Would they try to fight the coming changes, or would they accept them and find a way to adapt? It was an invitation of sorts. An invitation to join whatever this force was, to become part of something much larger than themselves. And in that moment, as the firestorms raged and the strange force continued its approach, humanity was faced with the greatest question of all. Could they learn to live with the unknown? Or would they resist it, hoping to preserve the world they had known, even if it meant losing everything they had worked for? The choice was theirs to make, but the consequences of that choice would echo through the future of humanity. As the days grew darker and the fires continued to consume everything in their path, humanity found itself at a crossroads. The very foundation of society, the peace and stability they had built over thousands of years, was collapsing around them. But as the world teetered on the brink of disaster, there was a sense of quiet determination that began to emerge. The people who had once relied on the certainty of their world now understood that their survival depended on their ability to adapt to the unknown. Dr. Rachel Sanchez, still deeply focused on the mysterious force in space, had a revelation. The energy field wasn't just an external threat. It was interacting with the planet in ways that suggested an evolution was taking place, not just in the atmosphere, but in humanity itself. Perhaps the fires were not merely of destructive force. They were a signal, a catalyst for change, urging people to evolve alongside the shifting Earth. But how could humanity possibly embrace such a transformation when everything they knew and loved was being torn apart? Despite the growing uncertainty, a number of global leaders and thinkers had begun to see things differently. They had come to understand that this was not a moment to fight for control, but to accept that their previous way of life was no longer viable. The fires had shown them that their reliance on technology, on stability, was an illusion. The world was changing, whether they were ready or not, and the only option left was to find a way to move forward. Dr. Sanchez became one of the leading voices in this new movement. She worked tirelessly, not just to understand the force in space, but to help guide humanity toward an understanding of the greater purpose that seemed to lie beyond the destruction. People began to look to her as a beacon of hope, as she championed the idea that the transformation could bring about a new kind of world, a world that would learn from the past mistakes and adapt to a future where human beings were no longer the center of the universe. As the fires continued to rage, people in the worst-hit areas found new ways to survive. In the cities where buildings had once stood tall, the ruins were slowly being reclaimed. People learned to live off the land once again, growing crops where the soil had been scorched, and finding shelter in the most unlikely of places. The world was beginning to rebuild, but it wasn't the same world it had been. The people weren't the same either. Across the globe, scientists and engineers began to develop new forms of technology designed to work in harmony with the shifting Earth. No longer was technology seen as something to control nature. Now, it was about finding ways to coexist with it. This new approach was inspired by the same energy field that had disrupted their old ways of life. It was a shift in perspective, a realization that they could no longer simply control their environment. They had to learn to live within it. Meanwhile, the strange message from the force in space continued to be studied. The cryptic communication had sparked something in humanity. It was as if the force was extending an olive branch, offering them a chance to join a greater community, a cosmic civilization that existed beyond their understanding. The message hinted at knowledge far beyond what humans had ever known. It promised a future of unity and evolution, but only if they were willing to accept the changes that were coming. There was, however, still a great deal of fear and skepticism. Not everyone believed that the force's intentions were as benign as it seemed. There were those who feared the unknown, who believed that accepting this invitation might mean the loss of their very identity. What would become of humanity if they gave in to this new order? Would they be able to retain their sense of individuality, or would they be subsumed into something far larger than themselves? In the midst of the uncertainty, there were those who were ready to embrace the change. They believed that humanity had already seen the limits of its old way of life. The peace they had enjoyed for so long had only been a temporary phase in the grand scheme of the universe. To continue to resist the changes would be futile, they argued. The fires were not a punishment but an opportunity to grow, to evolve, and to become something greater than they had ever imagined. Dr. Sanchez's work continued to push the boundaries of what was understood. She began to theorize that the force was not merely an external entity, but an awakening that was beginning to touch every aspect of life on Earth. The energy field, she hypothesized, was pushing humanity toward a new kind of consciousness, one that was in tune with the very forces of nature. It was as if the planet itself was calling to them, urging them to step into a new age of understanding and cooperation. But this transformation would not be without its challenges. As the world struggled to adapt to the new reality, there were those who fought against it, clinging desperately to the old ways. They believed that the fires and the changes were a test, something to endure rather than embrace. To them, the destruction was a sign that humanity had failed in some way and must return to the old ways of control and dominance. They feared that the new world being built would strip away the very things that made them human, their culture, their history, their individuality. Yet, for every voice of resistance, there were many more who saw the beauty in the new world that was emerging. People began to realize that the Earth was offering them a chance to reconnect with nature, to rebuild their lives in a way that honored the planet rather than exploited it. The fires had taught them humility, and the energy field that had once seemed so threatening now felt like a guide, an opportunity to evolve in ways that they had never thought possible. As the weeks stretched on, the fires finally began to subside, not because the threat had passed, but because humanity had learned to live alongside them. The world was no longer the place it had once been. It had been irrevocably changed, not just by the fires, but by the realization that humanity had to evolve, to adapt, and to embrace the unknown. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to welcome. And as the earth slowly healed, as the fires turned to embers, and the skies cleared, the question remained: what would humanity become? Would they resist the changes and cling to the past, or would they step into a new world, one defined not by the peace they had once known, but by the limitless possibilities that lay ahead? The choice was theirs to make, but the future was already unfolding, and humanity would soon learn what it meant to live in harmony with the unknown.